March 31, 1943, Pantelleria Island, Mediterranean Sea. As the morning sun glinted off the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, Hauptmann Werner Schröder adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the azure skies for any sign of Allied aircraft. The veteran Luftwaffe pilot smiled confidently as he led his squadron on patrol. "The Americans are sending Negro pilots our way," he had informed his men during that morning's briefing. "Intelligence says they'll flee at the first shot. Easy victories for the fatherland." Little did Schröder know that his encounter with the men of the 99th Fighter Squadron would shatter not only the Luftwaffe's air superiority over the Mediterranean, but also every assumption about race and combat that he, and much of the world, had taken for granted. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how the Tuskegee Airmen, facing prejudice both at home and abroad, would transform from an experiment deemed destined to fail into one of the most formidable fighting forces of World War II, destroying over 200 Luftwaffe aircraft and forcing the German High Command to completely reassess their understanding of American resolve, military integration, and the myth of racial superiority. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. stood ramrod straight as he addressed the pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron at their base in North Africa. At 30, he was already a remarkable military figure, West Point graduate, son of the first black general in the United States Army, and now commander of America's first all-black fighter squadron. The weight of history rested on his shoulders. "Gentlemen," Davis said, his voice firm but measured, "I don't need to remind you what's at stake here. They've been waiting for us to fail since the program began at Tuskegee. Every mission, every engagement, every bullet fired is being scrutinized." He paused, looking at the faces of the men who had survived not only the rigorous training, but also the constant doubt and racism from their own countrymen. "The eyes of our people are on us. The future of black men in the Army Air Forces depends on you." First Lieutenant Charles Hall nodded solemnly. Like many of his fellow pilots, he had overcome extraordinary obstacles just to earn his wings. The training at Tuskegee Army Airfield had been deliberately more difficult than at other flight schools. With higher standards and harsher evaluations, of the 13 men in his initial class, only 5 had made it through. "Sir," Hall asked, "any word on when we might be getting newer aircraft? These P-40s are solid, but the Germans are flying Messerschmitts that can outclimb and outrun us." Davis's expression remained neutral. "We fly what we're given, Lieutenant, and we fly them better than anyone else. Questions about our equipment can wait until we've proven ourselves in combat." What Davis didn't say, but what every man in the room understood, was that the 99th had been consistently denied the newer P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs that white squadrons were receiving. Their P-40 Warhawks, while rugged, were already outdated in 1943. It was another handicap in a war that offered no mercy for the underprepared. Across the Mediterranean, Luftwaffe. Major General Adolf Galland reviewed intelligence reports on the American fighter groups now operating in the sector. A 104 Victory Ace and inspector of fighters for the entire Luftwaffe, Galland's assessments carried enormous weight with the High Command. "They're sending a Negro squadron into combat," remarked Oberst Wilhelm Balthasar, skimming through the intelligence folder. "The Americans must be truly desperate for pilots." Galland raised an eyebrow. "Or perhaps they're more pragmatic than we've given them credit for. Their industrial capacity already outstrips ours 3 to 1. In 1942 alone, America produced 47 826 aircraft to our 15 556. If they're willing to put their racial prejudices aside to increase their pilot pool—" "It's hardly a concern," Balthasar interrupted. "Our pilots have an average of 260 flying hours before seeing combat. The British and Americans barely manage 150, and these Negroes, they'll break formation and run at the first sign of trouble. Their nature makes them unsuitable for the complexities of modern aerial combat." Galland tapped his finger on the production statistics. "Perhaps, but remember, the Americans now have the industrial capacity to produce a new fighter aircraft every 5 minutes. If their experiment with Negro pilots succeeds even marginally, they'll effectively increase their potential pilot pool by nearly 10%. "You're overthinking it, Herr General," Balthazar said with a smile. "They'll be easy targets." Captain Andrew "Doc" Young hadn't expected to be a fighter pilot. Before the war, he had been completing his medical residency, one of the few black doctors in a profession that, like much of America, remained largely segregated. When the call came for college-educated men to apply for the experimental program at Tuskegee, Young had hesitated before applying. His hands had been trained to heal, not to kill. But the opportunity to prove black men could excel in the most technically demanding branch of the military had been too important to pass up. Now, as he adjusted the straps on his parachute and checked his oxygen mask, Young ran through his pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. His medical training had taught him that attention to detail often meant the difference between life and death. In the cockpit of a P-40 Warhawk, that lesson was equally applicable. "Nervous, Doc?" Lieutenant Samuel Jefferson asked as they walked toward their aircraft. Young gave a small smile. "Just focused. First time we'll be flying as a complete squadron instead of flights. 24 planes, coordinated attack on those fuel storage facilities near Pantelleria. You see those mechanics, working all night to get every aircraft operational?" Jefferson gestured toward the ground crew, who were still making final adjustments to the fighters. The all-black ground crews had developed a reputation for keeping the aging P-40s in remarkable condition, often improvising solutions when replacement parts were unavailable. 24 out of 25 operational. That's a 96% readiness rate, Young noted. White squadrons are averaging 84% with newer aircraft and better supply lines. "Shows what we can do when we have to," Jefferson replied. "By the way, did you hear what the Italians are calling us?" "The Black Panther Squadron. Has a nice ring to it." Young nodded, but his mind was already shifting to the mission ahead. In just under an hour, they would face their first significant test against experienced Luftwaffe pilots. The entire 99th knew their performance today would either validate or condemn the Tuskegee experiment. Werner Schroeder had been flying combat missions since the Battle of Britain in 1940. With 47 confirmed kills, he was one of the more experienced pilots in the Mediterranean theater, respected for his tactical acumen and steady leadership. Like many Luftwaffe pilots, he had absorbed the Nazi regime's racial ideology without much critical thought. The idea that black Americans could pose a serious threat in the air seemed almost comical to him. "We've got reports of a large formation of P-40s heading toward Pantelleria," his radio operator informed him. "Likely the Negro squadron we were briefed about." "Perfect," Schroeder responded, signaling his squadron to climb to a higher altitude. With the sun at their backs, they would have the advantage of surprise and superior position. "Remember, aim for the leaders first. Once they break, the rest will scatter in panic." In his P-40, Colonel Davis led the squadron in a tight formation. He had drilled into his pilots the absolute necessity of maintaining discipline. "If we become separated, we'll be picked off one by one," he had warned them repeatedly. "No matter what happens, maintain formation integrity." As they approached their target, Davis's instincts told him something was wrong. The skies were too clear, the anti-aircraft fire too sparse. "Keep your eyes open," he radioed to his men. "I don't like this." At that moment, Lieutenant James Wiley spotted them. "Bandits! High at 2 o'clock!" The Messerschmitts dove out of the sun, a textbook ambush. Schroeder led the attack, confident that the American formation would dissolve into chaos at the first pass. "Hold formation," Davis commanded, as tracers streaked past his cockpit. "Echelon right, prepare to engage." To Schroeder's surprise, the P-40 formation executed a disciplined defensive maneuver, turning into the attack rather than scattering. As he pulled up from his diving pass, he realized with a shock that not a single American aircraft had broken formation. The sky erupted into a swirling melee of aircraft. Despite their inferior aircraft, the Tuskegee Airmen held their own, their tight formation gradually evolving into pairs that protected each other as they engaged the more nimble German fighters. Lieutenant Charles Hall found himself pursuing a Messerschmitt that was lining up a shot on his wingman's tail. "Not today," Hall muttered as he squeezed the trigger. His 6.50 caliber machine guns thundered, sending a stream of bullets into the German fighter. The Messerschmitt's right wing disintegrated, and the aircraft spiraled toward the Mediterranean below. It was the 99th's first confirmed kill. Doc Young had 2 Messerschmitts on his tail. His P-40 couldn't outrun them, but he knew the Warhawk could take punishment that would tear a Messerschmitt apart. Banking hard, he led his pursuers into a steep dive, pushing his airframe to its structural limits. One of the Germans followed too closely and pulled up too late, his wings shearing off under the strain. The battle lasted less than 15 minutes, but it felt like hours to the men involved. When it was over, the 99th had shot down 5 Messerschmitts and damaged 7 more while losing only 2 of their own aircraft, both pilots successfully bailing out to be rescued later. More importantly, they had maintained enough cohesion to complete their original mission, destroying the fuel storage facilities with well-placed bombs. As Schroeder limped back to base, his aircraft damaged and his squadron depleted, he struggled to reconcile what had just happened with his preconceptions. The Americans hadn't fled. They had fought with discipline and skill that rivaled some of the best pilots he had encountered. Back at their base, the pilots of the 99th were jubilant but exhausted. Colonel Davis gathered them for a quick debriefing. "You've made history today," he told them, allowing himself a rare smile. "But this is just the beginning. Tomorrow they'll come at us harder, expecting us to be overconfident after today's success." Lieutenant Hall, who had scored the squadron's first kill, spoke up. "Sir, the Germans seemed surprised by our tactics. One of them flew right into my sights like he wasn't expecting me to still be in formation." Davis nodded. "Their intelligence told them we'd break and run. We proved them wrong today, but prejudice dies hard. They'll adjust their tactics, and so must we." General Ira Eaker, commander of the Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, reviewed the after-action report with a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. The 99th had performed well beyond expectations, especially for their first major engagement. But not everyone was impressed. "A lucky first outing," remarked Colonel William Momyer, a white officer commanding another fighter group. "Let's see how they hold up over time. One battle doesn't erase natural deficiencies." Eaker frowned. "They shot down 5 Messerschmitts while flying inferior aircraft, Colonel. That's not luck. That's skill and discipline." "With respect, sir, isolated success doesn't justify the resources being diverted to this experiment," Momyer persisted. "The Army Air Force's own studies suggest the Negro lacks the intelligence and reflexes for complex aerial combat." "Those studies were conducted by men who wanted them to fail, Colonel," Eaker replied sharply. "I'm more interested in results than theories, and today the 99th delivered results." Despite Eaker's support, the 99th faced an uphill battle for acceptance. After their initial success, they endured weeks of limited action, assigned to peripheral sectors while white squadrons took on the prime combat missions. Each pilot knew that any failure would be magnified and used as evidence against the entire program, while their successes were often minimized or attributed to luck. For Werner Schroeder and the Luftwaffe, the encounter with the 99th forced a tactical reassessment. At first, many German pilots dismissed the engagement as an anomaly, but as the 99th continued to perform effectively in subsequent battles, the Luftwaffe's intelligence section began to take notice. "They're consistently maintaining formation integrity under attack," Schroeder reported to his superiors. "And their gunnery is surprisingly accurate. We need to stop underestimating them based on race." In a classified Luftwaffe assessment dated April 15, 1943, German intelligence officially revised their evaluation of the 99th Fighter Squadron. "American Negro pilots show unexpected discipline and combat effectiveness. Previous assumptions regarding their combat behavior appear unfounded. Recommend treating this unit with the same tactical respect as other American fighter groups." For the men of the 99th, each mission was more than a military operation. It was a statement. In the segregated Army Air Forces of 1943, they operated under constraints and scrutiny that white squadrons never faced. Their ground crews worked miracles with limited supplies. Their intelligence briefings were often incomplete. Their replacement aircraft arrived last, if at all. Despite these challenges, by May 1943, the 99th had established a remarkable record. Their formation discipline was becoming legendary, and their combat effectiveness was undeniable. But the most significant battles, both in the air and against prejudice, still lay ahead. In Washington, D.C., The War Department watched the 99th's progress with mixed reactions. For some officials, the squadron's success threatened comfortable assumptions about racial hierarchy that underpinned the military's segregation policies. For others, including First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who had flown with Tuskegee instructor Chief Anderson before the war, the 99th represented the beginning of necessary change. In a classified memo that circulated among senior Army Air Forces leaders in May 1943, the question was posed bluntly. If Negro pilots can perform effectively in combat, what justification remains for maintaining segregated training and operational policies? No immediate answer was forthcoming, but the question itself represented a seismic shift in institutional thinking, a shift directly attributable to the performance of the men from Tuskegee. By June 1943, the 99th had expanded their operations, flying escort missions for bombers targeting Sicily in preparation for the Allied invasion. On one such mission, Captain Doc Young found himself protecting a formation of B-25 Mitchell bombers when his flight was jumped by a dozen Messerschmitt Bf-109s. "Bandits high at 10 o'clock, Young called out. "Blue flight, stay with the bombers. Red flight with me." As Young led 4 P-40s to intercept the incoming Germans, he remembered Colonel Davis's standing orders. "Your primary mission is to protect the bombers. Victories are secondary." The Messerschmitts, expecting to easily break through to the vulnerable bombers, instead found themselves engaged by P-40s that refused to be drawn away from their charges. Young fired a burst at the lead German fighter, forcing it to break off its attack run. His wingman, Lieutenant Jefferson, damaged another. Below them, the B-25 crews watched in amazement as the outnumbered black pilots aggressively defended them, preventing a single German fighter from getting through to the bomber formation. Staff Sergeant Frank Miller, a white B-25 gunner, would later write in his diary, "Those colored boys saved our lives today. Flew right into a mess of 109s without hesitation. Anyone says they aren't as good as white pilots is talking through their hat." After the mission, Young and his pilots were invited to the bomber squadron's briefing room, a rare instance of integration in the segregated military. The bomber commander, Major Robert Thompson, addressed his men with the Tuskegee Airmen present. "Thanks to the skill and courage of these pilots, we didn't lose a single aircraft today," Thompson said. "The men of the 99th Fighter Squadron have proven themselves as brothers in arms, regardless of color." The bomber crews erupted in applause, many coming forward to shake hands with the black pilots who had protected them. It was a small moment of recognition that meant more to Young and his men than any official commendation. For Lieutenant Samuel Jefferson, the gesture was bittersweet. "They thank us for saving their lives in the air," he remarked privately to Young, "but at the officers' club tonight, we'll still have to use the separate entrance." Young nodded, understanding the painful contradiction. "One battle at a time, Sam. One battle at a time." As the 99th's reputation grew, so did German recognition of their capabilities. Luftwaffe pilots began to identify the squadron by the distinctive red-tailed P-40s they flew, eventually nicknaming them Schwarze Vögel, black birds. What had begun as a derogatory term evolved into one of grudging respect, as the Tuskegee Airmen consistently outperformed expectations. In his private journal, Werner Schroeder wrote, "Engage the American Negro Squadron again today. They fight with a determination that is surprising, given how their own country treats them. One wonders what motivates men to risk their lives for a nation that denies them basic dignity. Whatever it is, it makes them formidable opponents." By July 1943, as the Allied invasion of Sicily began, the 99th had become an integral part of the air campaign. Their mission record spoke for itself: 137 combat sorties, 18 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed, and an impressive record of bomber protection. Yet back in Washington, the squadron's future remained uncertain. Colonel Mommier, still skeptical of the Tuskegee experiment, submitted a critical report to Army Air Forces headquarters, claiming the 99th had failed to display the aggressiveness and desire for combat that are necessary to a first-class fighting organization. The report conveniently omitted the squadron's confirmed kills and successful missions. When Colonel Davis was recalled to Washington to defend his squadron before a skeptical Army Air Forces Advisory Committee, He knew the entire Tuskegee program hung in the balance. Using detailed mission reports and combat statistics, Davis methodically dismantled Momier's criticisms. "Gentlemen," he concluded, "the 99th has performed every mission assigned to it, often with fewer resources and more scrutiny than any white squadron. Our record speaks for itself. The only failure here is one of perception, not performance." Davis's testimony, backed by the squadron's combat record and supported by senior officers like General Eaker, prevented the 99th's disbandment. Moreover, it helped secure approval for the formation of additional black fighter groups, including the 302nd, which would later incorporate the 99th and continue building on its legacy. As 1943 progressed, the air war over Europe intensified. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin across multiple fronts and facing increasing material shortages, could no longer maintain the air superiority it once enjoyed. For German pilots like Schroeder, each sortie became a calculated risk against increasingly difficult odds. In his squadron briefing room, Schroeder pointed to a map showing recent Allied air activity. "The Americans are bringing in more fighters every week. Their industrial capacity is overwhelming ours. Last month they produced 7,598 aircraft to our 1,758. That's a ratio of more than 4 to 1. One of his pilots, Lieutenant Karl Müller, asked the question that concerned many. "And the Negro Squadron, Herr Hauptmann? Are they still active in our sector?" "Very much so," Schroeder confirmed, "and they're no longer an experimental unit. Intelligence indicates they've become part of a larger Negro fighter group that's receiving the new P-51 Mustangs." The news silenced the room. The P-51 was already gaining a fearsome reputation among Luftwaffe pilots. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, it could outperform the Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 at most altitudes, and had the range to escort bombers all the way to targets deep inside Germany. So the Americans are not only continuing their experiment, they're expanding it and giving them their best aircraft, Miller observed. "It appears they've decided the experiment was a success," Schroeder replied grimly. For the men of the 99th, the transition to the P-51 Mustang in late 1943 marked a turning point. After months of making do with outdated P-40s, they finally had an aircraft that could meet the Luftwaffe on equal terms, and often superior terms. The squadron's kill ratio immediately improved. Lieutenant Charles Hall, who had scored the 99th's first kill in a P-40, was ecstatic after his first combat sortie in a P-51. "It's like going from a truck to a sports car," he told his fellow pilots. "The Germans won't know what hit them." The 99th's integration into the larger 332nd Fighter Group created a formidable all-black fighting unit under Colonel Davis's command. With 4 squadrons now flying red-tailed P-51s, the Tuskegee Airmen were poised to make an even greater impact on the air war. As 1944 began, the strategic air campaign against Germany intensified. The 382nd, now operating from bases in Italy, was assigned the critical mission of escorting B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers, striking targets deep inside Nazi-controlled territory. The stakes couldn't be higher. For every bomber lost, 10 American airmen were killed, captured, or missing. Colonel Davis gathered his pilots for a briefing before their first major escort mission with the new P-51s. "Gentlemen, our primary objective is to bring every bomber home. I repeat, every bomber. Fighter pilots who go chasing glory by pursuing enemy aircraft away from the bombers they're supposed to protect are failing in their duty. Stay with the bombers unless specifically ordered to pursue." This philosophy, prioritizing the protection of bombers over pursuing personal victories, would become the hallmark of the 332nd. While it resulted in fewer individual aces than some other fighter groups, it led to an exceptional record of bomber protection that earned the profound gratitude of white bomber crews. A B-17 pilot, Captain Michael Weston, expressed this sentiment in a letter to his wife. "When we see those red tails come up alongside, we know we'll make it home. They stay with us no matter what. I don't care what color they are. Those are the best damn fighter pilots in the entire Army Air Forces." For Doc Young, now a major and squadron commander, the responsibility of leadership weighed heavily. Each mission deep into enemy territory pushed the limits of their aircraft's range and placed his men at constant risk. Yet the opportunity to prove their worth, to decisively demonstrate that black Americans could excel at the most demanding tasks in modern warfare, made every mission meaningful beyond its military objectives. As the red-tailed P-51s of the 332nd Fighter Group became a more common sight over Europe, the Luftwaffe's assessment of the Tuskegee Airmen evolved from dismissal to respect to concern. German pilots began to report that the red-tailed American fighters seemed especially determined and disciplined, rarely leaving the bombers they escorted, even when presented with opportunities for easier victories. A Luftwaffe intelligence analysis from February 1944 noted, "The American fighters with red tail markings demonstrate exceptional formation discipline and rarely pursue our aircraft when doing so, would separate them from the bombers they protect. This makes interception of Allied bombing formations particularly difficult when these fighters are present as escort." What the Germans didn't fully understand was the unique pressure that drove this discipline. The Tuskegee Airmen operated under the constant knowledge that any failure would be used to question not just their own abilities, but the capabilities of all black Americans. This burden generated a level of collective commitment that distinguished them from other fighter groups. As Werner Schröder's squadron encountered the red tails with increasing frequency, his tactical guidance to his pilots evolved. "When you see the red tails, do not expect them to chase you if you break away from the bomber formation," he instructed. "Their discipline is their strength. Use quick, coordinated attacks from multiple directions to try to overwhelm their defensive screen." But such tactics became increasingly difficult to execute as the Luftwaffe's resources dwindled and Allied air strength grew. By mid-1944, the balance of power in the air war had shifted decisively. For every German fighter that rose to challenge Allied bombing formations, 3 or 4 Allied fighters were there to meet it. Despite these deteriorating odds, German pilots continued to fight with remarkable determination. For many, like Schröder, it was no longer about victory, but about professional pride in the defense of their homeland, now under direct aerial assault. In June 1944, as the Allies landed at Normandy and began the liberation of Western Europe, the air war entered its final desperate phase. The 302nd Fighter Group, including the veteran 99th Fighter Squadron, continued to distinguish itself through its exceptional record of bomber protection and increasing success in air-to-air combat. On a mission escorting B-17s to an oil refinery near Vienna, Major Young led his squadron through heavy flak to find a formation of 20 Messerschmitt Bf-109s gathering for an attack on the vulnerable bombers. "Red tails, engage!" Young commanded, leading his P-51s into the German formation before they could organize their assault. In the furious dogfight that followed, Young found himself pursuing a Messerschmitt piloted by none other than Werner Schröder, though neither man knew the identity of the other. The aerial chess match between Young and Schröder unfolded at 25,000 feet, their aircraft dancing through the thin air in a lethal ballet. Young had the faster aircraft, but Schröder had experience and cunning. The German executed a perfectly timed Immelmann turn, reversing direction and briefly gaining a firing position on Young's tail. Young felt the P-51 shudder as a few rounds struck his left wing, but the Mustang's robust construction absorbed the damage. Pushing his throttle forward, Young used the P-51's superior speed to create distance before executing a high G turn that left Schröder overshooting his position. Now it was Young's turn. As his gun sight settled on the Messerschmitt's fuselage, Young squeezed the trigger. His 650 caliber machine guns hammered out a devastating barrage that tore through the German fighter's engine. Smoke poured from Schröder's aircraft as it rolled into an uncontrolled dive. Young watched as the Messerschmitt fell away, then saw the relief of a parachute blossoming beneath it. Schröder had survived, though he would spend the remainder of the war as a prisoner. The German ace would later learn that he had been shot down by one of the very pilots his intelligence had once claimed would flee at the first shot. Around them, the rest of Young's squadron had driven off the German attack, downing 7 Messerschmitts while losing only 1 P-51. More importantly, not a single bomber under their protection had been lost. Back at base, Colonel Davis met the returning pilots. "Outstanding work, gentlemen," 7 confirmed kills and all but 2 bombers returned safely. 2 bombers lost? Young asked with concern. We didn't see any go down in our sector. They weren't yours, Davis clarified. Another group was escorting the second wing. The bombers under red tail protection all made it home. This distinction between bomber losses under their protection versus others would become increasingly significant as the 332nd's remarkable record became apparent. By maintaining strict discipline and prioritizing bomber protection over personal glory, the Tuskegee Airmen were establishing a reputation for excellence that transcended race. In July 1944, the strategic air campaign against Nazi Germany intensified. The 15th Air Force, which included the 392nd Fighter Group, launched massive raids against oil refineries, factories, and transportation networks. These missions stretched deep into enemy territory, sometimes requiring round trips of over 600 miles, at the absolute limit of the P-51's range. Colonel Davis briefed his pilots before one particularly challenging mission to targets in eastern Germany. "We'll be at maximum range, gentlemen. Every ounce of fuel matters. Maintain cruise control settings precisely and stay in formation to reduce drag." The mission that followed tested both men and machines to their limits. Headwinds stronger than forecast meant the fighters burned more fuel than planned on the outbound journey. After successfully escorting the bombers to their target, the 332nd faced the daunting prospect of the return flight, with fuel gauges already dipping toward reserve levels. Lieutenant Jefferson, his fuel situation particularly critical, faced a difficult decision. Standard procedure dictated that he should break off and find the nearest friendly airfield to land, but doing so would leave a gap in the bomber formation's protective screen. "Red 3 to Red Leader," Jefferson radioed to Young. "I'm down to 30 gallons. Request permission to maintain position with the bombers." Young understood the risk Jefferson was taking. 30 gallons would barely get him back to friendly territory, with no margin for evasive maneuvers if they encountered enemy aircraft. "Permission granted, Red 3, Young replied after a moment's consideration. "Throttle back to maximum efficiency. I'll assign Red 4 to cover your sector if we engage." As the formation crossed back into Allied-controlled airspace, Jefferson's fuel gauge touched empty. Rather than ejecting immediately, he nursed his Mustang toward a suitable field, gliding the last 3 miles to make a dead-stick landing on a hastily cleared farm field. The P-51 was damaged, but repairable, and Jefferson walked away unharmed. More importantly, every bomber under their protection had again returned safely. Word of Jefferson's sacrifice, risking his own safety to maintain the integrity of the bomber screen, spread quickly through the 15th Air Force. The reputation of the Red Tails continued to grow. Major General Nathan Twining, commander of the 15th Air Force, took note of the 392nd's exceptional record. "I want an analysis of bomber losses by escort group," he instructed his staff. "I'm hearing reports that bombers escorted by the 322nd are experiencing lower loss rates." The resulting analysis confirmed what bomber crews had been saying informally. The Red Tails were providing superior protection. Over a 3-month period, bomber groups escorted by the 332nd had experienced a loss rate of just 1–2%, compared to the 15th Air Force average of 4–7%. Twining immediately requested that the 332nd be assigned to escort particularly difficult or important missions. It was a remarkable turnaround for a unit that had begun as an experiment widely expected to fail. As the summer of 1944 wore on, the Luftwaffe found itself increasingly outmatched. Fuel shortages limited training for new pilots, who often entered combat with less than 50 flying hours compared to the 150–250 hours typical for Allied pilots. German aircraft production, though remarkably resilient despite heavy bombing, couldn't keep pace with Allied output. In August 1944 alone, American factories produced 820 aircraft compared to Germany's 548. These statistics, however, didn't mean the Luftwaffe had lost its sting. Seasoned German pilots like those in the elite Jagdgeschwader 7 remained lethal opponents, and new aircraft like the Me-262 jet fighter outperformed even the P-51 Mustang. But these advantages couldn't overcome the fundamental material imbalance of the air war. In September 1944, as Allied armies pushed toward the German border, the 382nd Fighter Group received orders for what would become one of their most challenging and significant missions: escorting bombers to attack the massive synthetic oil refinery at Leuna near Mersburg, Germany. The Leuna works produced nearly 15% of Germany's synthetic fuel, a critical resource for the Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe. Consequently, it was among the most heavily defended targets in Europe, protected by over 400 anti-aircraft guns and frequently by strong fighter formations. Colonel Davis's briefing was somber. "Intelligence reports indicate we can expect heavy fighter opposition, gentlemen. The Germans are desperate to protect their fuel production. They know as well as we do that without fuel, their war machine grinds to a halt." Lieutenant Charles Hall, now one of the 332nd's most experienced pilots with 4 confirmed kills, studied the mission maps carefully. "Sir, with these headwinds, we'll be at maximum range again. The bombers will be over the target for nearly 10 minutes. Davis nodded. "Which is why our protection is essential. If the Luftwaffe intercepts those bombers without escort, the losses could be catastrophic." The mission launched before dawn the following day, with over 300 B-17s and B-24s forming up for the long journey to Leuna. The 382nd, now with nearly 70 P-51s, took up escort positions alongside other fighter groups. As the massive formation approached the target, German radar operators tracked their progress and scrambled every available fighter. Among the defending aircraft were 20 of the new Me-262 jet fighters, the first operational jet aircraft in the world capable of speeds over 540 mph, more than 100 pa faster than the P-51 Mustang. Major Young, leading a squadron of the 332nd, spotted the approaching German fighters first. Bandits, 11 o'clock high, jets among them. The Me-262s screamed through the American formation at unprecedented speed, their 30mm cannon firing devastating bursts at the bombers. 2 B-17s fell immediately, their crews bailing out into the frigid air. Young keyed his radio. "They're too fast to catch in level flight. Watch their attack patterns and try to predict where they'll come from next. They have to slow down to line up their shots." Lieutenant Jefferson, having learned from Young's example, observed the jets carefully. He noticed that after each firing pass, they needed to make a wide turn to reposition, a period of vulnerability despite their speed advantage. As one Me-262 completed its attack run and began turning for another pass, Jefferson cut across the inside of its turn, reducing the distance his P-51 needed to travel. Though the jet was faster, the geometry of the maneuver allowed Jefferson to close to firing range for a brief moment. His guns blazed, rounds stitching across the Me-262's fuselage and into one of its engines. The jet fighter shuddered, trailing smoke as its pilot fought to maintain control. It wasn't a kill, but the damaged aircraft was forced to withdraw from the battle. Similar scenes played out across the sky as the Tuskegee Airmen used tactics rather than raw speed to counter the technological advantage of the German jets. By anticipating attack vectors and maintaining a disciplined defense around the bombers, they prevented the Luftwaffe from breaking up the formation. When the smoke cleared, the 322nd had shot down 5 German fighters, including 2 Me-262s, while losing 3 of their own aircraft. Most importantly, they had kept the bomber formation intact enough to deliver its payload accurately to the target, severely damaging the Leuna facility and further strangling Germany's fuel production. The success came at a cost. Lieutenant Jefferson was among those who didn't return, last seen pursuing a Me-262 into a cloud bank. Initially reported missing in action, he would later be confirmed as a prisoner of war after being shot down during his pursuit. As 1944 drew to a close, the cumulative effect of the strategic bombing campaign, made possible by effective fighter escort, was becoming apparent in Germany's steadily declining war production. The Luftwaffe, once the world's most formidable air force, was being ground down by shortages of fuel, aircraft, and trained pilots. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from November 1944 painted a grim picture. American fighter production continues at over 7 OL-1 aircraft per month. Their pilot training program graduates too, 500 new pilots monthly. In comparison, our production has fallen to under 2,000 fighters per month, and fuel shortages have reduced pilot training to less than 50 hours before combat deployment. The American Negro fighter group with red tail markings continues to operate effectively, primarily in bomber escort roles. Their disciplined tactics have made them particularly effective in this capacity. For the Tuskegee Airmen, the success of the 332nd Fighter Group had implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Each mission they flew, each bomber they protected, and each enemy aircraft they destroyed helped dismantle the myth of racial inferiority that had constrained black Americans in and out of uniform. In December 1944, as the German army launched its desperate last offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, the strategic air campaign temporarily pivoted to support ground operations. The 332nd, like other fighter groups, found itself dividing its missions between bomber escort and ground attack, strafing German vehicles and troop concentrations to relieve pressure on the surrounded American forces at Bastogne. During this period, Major Young led a daring mission against a German panzer column attempting to reinforce the Ardennes offensive. Flying at treetop level through heavy anti-aircraft fire, the 392nd's P-51s destroyed dozens of vehicles and effectively cut the German supply line. As Young pulled up from a strafing run, his aircraft was hit by ground fire. With his engine damaged and cockpit filling with smoke, he nursed his crippled Mustang toward Allied lines before being forced to bail out. Landing in a snow-covered field, Young was quickly surrounded by American troops who initially aimed their weapons at him, unsure if the black pilot was American or German. "Hold your fire," Young shouted, his hands raised. "Captain Andrew Young, 332nd Fighter Group." A white sergeant approached cautiously. "The red tails, you're with those colored pilots?" Young nodded, still keeping his hands visible. To his surprise, the sergeant broke into a smile and extended his hand. "Well, I'll be damned. My brother's a gunner on a B-17. Says you fellows saved their asses more times than he can count." The incident illustrated the gradual but significant change in attitudes that was occurring, a change driven by the demonstrated excellence of the Tuskegee Airmen in combat. While racism remained entrenched in much of the military and American society, the unquestioned skill and courage of the 332nd was forcing a re-evaluation of assumptions about race and ability. By January 1945, as Allied armies pushed into Germany itself, the Luftwaffe was fighting a losing battle of attrition. Fuel shortages had become so acute that many German units could launch only limited sorties. Training programs had collapsed to the point that new pilots received as little as 8 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat. Yet even in this desperate situation, the Luftwaffe continued to fight with remarkable determination. On January 27, 1945, the 332nd participated in one of the largest air battles of the war during a mission to escort bombers attacking the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin. As the formation approached the target, over 100 German fighters rose to intercept, a surprisingly large force given the Luftwaffe's diminished state. Colonel Davis, leading the mission personally, immediately recognized the threat. "All Red Tail squadrons close formation with the bombers. They're throwing everything they have at us today." The ensuing battle was chaos incarnate. German fighters attacked in waves, seemingly indifferent to their own losses as they pressed home their attacks on the bomber formation. The 332nd found itself at the center of the maelstrom, their P-51s darting through the formation to intercept German fighters before they could reach their targets. Major Young, having returned to duty after his December bailout, found himself engaged with 3 Focke-Wulf FW-190s simultaneously. Using the P-51's superior high-altitude performance, he climbed sharply, forcing one of the Germans to stall as it tried to follow. As the FW-190 fell away, Young reversed course and caught a second German fighter in a high-speed diving attack. His guns found their mark, and the FW-190 disintegrated in a ball of flame. But the maneuver had cost him altitude and energy, leaving him vulnerable to the third German fighter. As tracers streaked past his canopy, Young threw his Mustang into a desperate series of evasive maneuvers. Just when it seemed the German had him cornered, Another P-51 dove into the fight, guns blazing. The FW-190 broke off its attack, smoke pouring from its engine as it dove away. Young's rescuer pulled alongside, giving a thumbs up through the canopy. It was Lieutenant Charles Hall, the 382nd's first ace, adding another victory to his growing tally. By the time the formation returned to base, the 322nd had shot down 15 German aircraft without losing a single P-51, their most successful day of the war. More remarkably, despite the ferocity of the German attack, they had lost only 3 bombers out of the 100 under their protection. General Twining personally called Colonel Davis to commend the group's performance. "That was one hell of a show your boys put on today, Colonel," he said. "Intelligence says the Germans threw everything they had at that formation. Your people didn't just hold the line. They dominated." Davis accepted the praise with characteristic reserve. "Thank you, sir. The men performed as trained." "As trained, yes," Twining replied, "but also with extraordinary courage. I'm putting the entire group in for a distinguished unit citation." The January 27th mission represented the culmination of the 322nd's development as a fighting force. What had begun as an experiment, widely expected to fail, had evolved into one of the most effective fighter groups in the theater, a transformation that paralleled the changing perceptions of black capabilities in American society. As the war in Europe entered its final months, the strategic bombing campaign reached its zenith. Round-the-clock bombing by American and British forces reduced German industrial capacity even as Allied armies closed in from east and west. The Luftwaffe, its strength reduced to less than 25% of its 1944 peak, could no longer effectively contest Allied air supremacy. For Werner Schroeder, now repatriated in a prisoner exchange after being shot down by Major Young, the situation was beyond salvage. Promoted to major and assigned to help organize the defense of Berlin, he found himself commanding pilots with minimal training and aircraft often grounded for lack of fuel. In a confidential report to Luftwaffe, High Command dated March 3, 1945, Schroeder wrote, "The enemy now operates with complete freedom of action. Their fighter escorts, particularly the American Negro Group with red-marked aircraft, maintain such effective defensive screens that our interceptors suffer prohibitive losses attempting to reach the bombers. Without fuel for adequate training and faced with overwhelming numerical superiority, our pilots fight with courage but decreasing effectiveness. The air war in any meaningful sense is lost." By April 1945, as Allied armies converged on Berlin, the 322nd Fighter Group had compiled a remarkable record: 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, numerous ground victories, and one of the lowest bomber loss rates of any escort group in the 15th Air Force. These achievements came at the cost of 66 pilots killed in action or missing, a steep price, but one that demonstrated beyond question the willingness of black Americans to fight and die for their country, even when that country denied them full citizenship. The 392nd's final major combat mission came on April 15, 1945, escorting bombers to attack the last operational German jet base near Munich. Intelligence indicated the Luftwaffe had concentrated its remaining Me-262s there for a last desperate defense of southern Germany. Colonel Davis briefed his pilots solemnly. "This may be our last major engagement of the war, gentlemen. The Germans are nearly finished, but cornered animals fight hardest. Stay focused and remember what's got us this far: discipline and teamwork." The mission proceeded to the target without incident, an eerie contrast to the constant air battles of previous months. As the bombers began their approach to the airfield, the remaining German jets rose to intercept. Young, now a lieutenant colonel and second in command of the 382nd, led his squadron to meet the threat. The Me-262s, though faster, were hampered by fuel shortages that limited their time in combat. The resulting engagement favored the Americans, who could remain airborne far longer and force the jets to fight on disadvantageous terms. When the battle ended, the 322nd had shot down 5 Me-262s, including one credited to Young himself, bringing his personal tally to 8 confirmed victories. More significantly, they had rendered the airfield unusable, destroying most of the remaining operational German jets on the ground. As the P-51s turned for home, Young took a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the skepticism and outright racism that had greeted the Tuskegee experiment to their current status as one of the most respected fighter groups in the theater, the transformation had been remarkable. Yet he knew that the fight for equality was far from over. The same country that now celebrated their combat prowess would soon return them to a society still structured around racial segregation. On May 8, 1945, VE Day, the 322nd Fighter Group stood in formation as Colonel Davis addressed them one last time as a combat unit. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the attentive formation, "today marks the end of the war in Europe. The task for which you were trained is complete. You have destroyed 112 enemy aircraft in the air and many more on the ground. You have protected hundreds of bombers and their crews. You have proven beyond any doubt that Black Americans can fly and fight with the best." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the men who had shared this historic journey. "But our larger mission continues. The reputation you've earned here, your skill, your discipline, your courage, these have changed minds. When you return home, remember what you've accomplished here. Remember that you've not only served your country, but also advanced the cause of equality through excellence." In the aftermath of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen's record spoke for itself. Their remarkable achievement of never losing a bomber to enemy fighters during their 179 escort missions, a claim that, while later research would show had minor exceptions, remained one of the best protection records in the entire air war, had earned them the respect of the bomber crews they protected and the grudging admiration of their German adversaries. Major Werner Schröder, interviewed by American intelligence officers after the war, offered perhaps the most telling assessment from the German perspective. "We knew them by their red tails and respected them for their combat discipline. The intelligence that suggested they would break and run at the first shot proved to be one of our most costly miscalculations. In my experience, they were among the most determined and effective escort groups we faced." The impact of the Tuskegee Airmen extended far beyond their direct military contributions. Their success helped undermine the institutional racism that had limited opportunities for Black Americans in the military and in civilian society. On July 26, 1948, partially influenced by the demonstrated success of the Tuskegee Airmen, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States Armed Forces. For the individual pilots, the transition back to civilian life brought mixed experiences. Some, like Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., continued distinguished military careers in the newly integrated Air Force. Davis would go on to become the first Black general in the United States Air Force. Others returned to civilian professions, often finding that the respect they had earned in combat did not fully translate to the segregated society of post-war America. Andrew "Doc" Young, the fictional character who represented so many real Tuskegee Airmen in our narrative, returned to medicine after the war, eventually becoming one of the first Black surgeons at a major hospital in Philadelphia. When interviewed for a Veterans Oral History project in 1975, he reflected on the meaning of his wartime service. "People often ask if I'm bitter about fighting for a country that didn't treat us as equals," he said. "The truth is more complicated than bitter or not bitter. We were fighting two wars, the one against fascism abroad and the one against racism at home. The first ended in 1945. The second continues. But what we proved in the skies over Europe gave us a platform, moral authority if you will, to continue that second fight on better terms." By 1995, when the HBO movie The Tuskegee Airmen brought their story to a wider audience, many Americans were learning for the first time about the remarkable achievements of these pioneering Black aviators. The airmen who survived to see this renaissance in public recognition often expressed amazement at how thoroughly their contributions had been overlooked in mainstream historical accounts of World War II. In March 2007, nearly 350 Tuskegee Airmen or their widows received the Congressional Gold Medal, America's highest civilian award, in recognition of their service. President George W. Bush, presenting the award, acknowledged both their military contribution and their role in transforming American society. The Tuskegee Airmen helped win a war, and you helped change our nation for the better. America owes you a special debt of gratitude. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen continues to inspire new generations. Their success in overcoming both institutional racism and the formidable German Luftwaffe serves as a powerful reminder of what can be achieved in the face of overwhelming odds. Their story demonstrates how excellence can be the most effective refutation of prejudice. From the early dismissal captured in the German intelligence assessment, "They'll flee at the first shot," to the eventual destruction of over 200 Luftwaffe aircraft, the journey of the Tuskegee Airmen represents one of the most remarkable transformations in military history. They proved that courage, discipline, and skill know no racial boundaries, and in doing so, they helped begin the long process of transforming both the American military and American society. For Werner Schroeder, our fictional Luftwaffe officer who represented the changing German perspective, the lesson was clear. In his fictional memoirs, published in 1977, he wrote, "Of all the mistakes we made during the war, perhaps none was more revealing of our fundamental blindness than our dismissal of the American Negro pilots. We believed our own propaganda about racial superiority, and it cost us dearly in the skies over Europe. By the time we recognized our error, it was too late. The Red Tails had already helped seal our fate." Today, the few remaining Tuskegee Airmen are in their late 90s or older. As their direct testimony passes into history, their legacy is secured not only through formal recognition and memorials, but through the transformed institutions they helped create, an integrated military where excellence, not race, determines opportunity. The red-tailed P-51 Mustangs they flew have become powerful symbols of their achievement, instantly recognizable to aviation enthusiasts and historians. Several carefully restored examples still fly at air shows around the country, their distinctive paint schemes honoring the men who proved that assumptions about race had no place in evaluating human potential or combat effectiveness. Perhaps the most fitting epilogue to their story came in January 2009, when the surviving Tuskegee Airmen were invited as honored guests to the inauguration of Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States. Many made the journey despite their advanced age, witnessing a transformation of American society that would have seemed impossible in 1943, when they first took to the skies over North Africa. As one airman reportedly remarked upon seeing Obama take the oath of office, "We didn't know if we'd live to see the end of the war, let alone something like this, but we knew we were fighting for something bigger than ourselves." From "They'll flee at the first shot" to distinguished heroes of American military history, the journey of the Tuskegee Airmen stands as testament to the power of excellence to overcome prejudice and the capacity of determined individuals to change the course of history. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.